I have a confession to make, and that is that I'm a huge Bible nerd. And this video is going to expose how much of a Bible nerd I am. But if you're here, you probably are a Bible nerd as well. So today we're going to be talking about Codex Claromontanus and the Esdras problem and how those two things might be related. If you are a Catholic, this is a huge deal. If you are a Protestant, this is also a huge deal because Protestants will use the Esdras problem as a weapon against Catholics. It's an apologetic tool to dismantle the authority system of the Catholic Church. So this is a really big topic. The stakes are very high, but it's very complicated and goes down some rabbit holes. And in this video, I'd like to just cover maybe one contribution to that discussion that I haven't heard anybody else talk about, and that's the role of Codex Claromontanus and Stichometry in the question of the Esdras problem. If you find this topic at all interesting, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. And without any further ado, let's get into it. So many early Christian Bible canon lists include two books of Esdras. You might have seen early Christian lists where they say something like Esdras, two books, okay? And most people just assume that these two books are Ezra and Nehemiah. However, manuscript witnesses like Codex Vaticanus and Codex Alexandrinus indicate that these two books of Esdras are not Ezra and Nehemiah. Instead, they are Ezra and Nehemiah in one book and First Esdras. And First Esdras is a completely different book. It's an apocryphal book for Catholics and for Protestants both. And they call these names in these manuscripts Esdras A, which is First Esdras, and Esdras B, which is Ezra and Nehemiah in one book, okay? Now, most fathers and early Christian synods were based on the Septuagint tradition. That's what they were drawing from. The Septuagint was the most popular and widespread used version of the Old Testament in the early church, okay? So this leads us to believe that when these fathers and councils listed two books of Esdras, they were including First Esdras in their canon. Now, that's a problem if you're a Protestant. That's a problem if you're a Catholic. Because, like I said earlier, First Esdras is apocryphal for Protestants and Catholics. So it's a big deal if the early church included First Esdras. Now, this also includes the canon from the Council of Carthage. And I have a screenshot here. You can see it says Esdras Libri Duo, okay, two books of Esdras. Now, what are those two books? If those are Esdras A and B, like Codex Vaticanus and Codex Alexandrinus, then that first book of Esdras is First Esdras, that apocryphal book for Catholics and Protestants. Now, there are many scholars who hold this view. Henry Howarth, Henry Sweet, C.C. Torrey, okay? And Protestants will use this as against the Catholic apologists because Catholics have defined the two books of Esdras in the Council of Trent as Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, if these two books are not Ezra and Nehemiah, but are Ezra and Nehemiah and First Esdras, then the Council of Carthage's Bible canon is different than the canon at Trent, and it breaks the continuity of the Catholic Church's canon with the early church. Now, of course, some Catholic scholars push back against this view with very compelling arguments. Catholics like Hugh Pope or David Sarraz, okay? So there are pushbacks to this view, and both sides make quite compelling arguments, okay? Now, what's at stake with this question? A lot, right? If you're Orthodox, what's in question is the canonicity of First Esdras. Is this a part of the Orthodox canon or not? If you can't interpret those two books of Esdras accurately, then it really puts First Esdras in an uncomfortable place for Orthodox who rely on the church's tradition for its canon. For Catholics, this is a huge question that needs to be answered because the truthfulness of the Council of Trent rests on this question. If Trent is wrong, then it really undermines the whole authority structure of the Catholic Church. And for Protestants, this is also huge because if they can successfully prove that the early Christian lists included First Esdras, then they can debunk the authority of the Council of Trent by pointing out an error that it made. And this argument is made by many Protestant apologists like James White. Now, this debate is continuing to the present. Okay, you'll find people on both sides, good scholars on both sides, who are arguing this debate. And in this video, I'm not going to give you a definitive solution. What I am doing is I'm going to offer what I think is an interesting contribution to this question using stichometry. Okay, and this is an argument or a piece of evidence that I just haven't heard anybody bring up before. So I'm making a video about it to sort of shed some light on this particular line of argumentation. So what is stichometry? Well, stichometry is a counting of lines, okay, stichi, in a manuscript. So in the ancient manuscript was handwritten, they would count each of the lines in a book, and then that number would be used to determine the cost of copying that book. Okay, so it was a convenient thing to have the number of lines because it would determine how much you would charge for a book. Of course, a big book's going to have lots of lines, and a small book will have few lines. So what can stichometry contribute to the Esdras problem? Well, stichometry tells us about textual variance and how big books were. Okay, so Henry Sweet acknowledges this. He says, stichometrical variation is doubtless chiefly or largely due to divergent types of text. So stichometry indicates variance in text types. So that could be very interesting if you're looking at stichometry for the books of Esdras when there are different naming conventions, right? So you think about it, if Esdras includes first Esdras or doesn't, it's going to have a totally different stichometric value. So you can look at early Christian lists with stichometry and get an idea of what those contained with regards to the Esdras material. Now we have a few canon lists with stichometry. We have the Stichometry of Nicephorus from the 9th century. We have Mommsen's list from the 4th century. And of course we have the catalog in Codex Claromontanus. Now Nicephorus's list is a little bit too new to be relevant to the early church. 9th century is centuries after the early church, so there's no real guarantee that that reflects the condition of the naming of the books of Esdras in the 4th century or earlier. Mommsen's list doesn't have Esdras material for some reason, unfortunately, but the catalog of Codex Claromontanus dates to the 4th century, and it does contain Esdras, and it does have a stichometric value there, okay? So its age and its content make it relevant, I think, in this discussion. So here's a screenshot of what it looks like. It has all the books of the Bible listed with a number there to the right of the name of the book. And you can see at the very end of it, the very last one, it says Hesdra. That's the Latin name for Esdras. And it has the letters ID there, the I standing for 1000 and D for 500. So with the lines of Esdras provided by Codex Claromontanus, we can determine if they were large enough to have included all of the Esdras material like codices B and A. Okay, so did it include first Esdras, Ezra and Nehemiah, like codices B and A? Or was it too small? Was it small like just Ezra and Nehemiah, or small just like first Esdras? Well, Codex Claromontanus contains in its list a single book called Hesdra, okay? One book, Esdras. Doesn't say two books. That's interesting. And it provides the number of lines for that book of Esdras as 1,500 lines. So what is this book of Esdras? Is it first Esdras? Is it Ezra and Nehemiah in one book? Is it first Esdras, Ezra, and Nehemiah all in one book? Well, this stichometry will help us to answer this question. Now, according to Eric Klosterman's Analecta, first Esdras has 1,300 lines, and Ezra and Nehemiah has 1,800 lines. That means together they have a total of 3,100 lines. So we know about how many lines are in these books. That indicates that, so very, very interesting, very importantly, this indicates that Esdras, for Codex Claromontanus, cannot include first Esdras and Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, so right away, the results are very interesting. 3,100 lines is way too big to be squeezed into 1,500 lines, which Codex Claromontanus is indicating, okay? Now, what that means is we might be looking at 1,500 lines as being Ezra and Nehemiah in one book. And this would agree with St. Jerome, the Council of Trent, as the Catholics would interpret the two books of Esdras as. So looking at this on a graph, we have the blue bar is Codex Claromontanus, the orange bar is Ezra and Nehemiah at 1800 lines, and then we have the green bar which represents first Esdras, Ezra and Nehemiah, like in Codex Vaticanus and Alexandrinus, and you can see that the full Ezra material from the Great Uncials, Alexandrinus and Vaticanus, is way higher than what's in Codex Claromontanus. However, if Claromontanus is compared to just Ezra and Nehemiah, it's not too big of a difference. It's quite similar, and we could explain the differences between those two as just page size differences or local standards or something like that. But you can see that it seems like it's much more likely that Codex Claromontanus's Esdras is Ezra and Nehemiah than first Esdras, Ezra and Nehemiah, like the Great Uncials. Now, you could push back and you could argue that the number of lines is unreliable because it varies depending on page size, poetic devices, or divisions in sense, local standards. Okay, so you could say that, well, counting the lines is not very reliable for different reasons. However, we can arrive at a similar value by converting the lines into word counts. Okay, so let's calculate this without using external manuscripts. Let's look at the stichometry of other books within Codex Claromontanus. It says that Judith has 1,300 lines and Malachi has 200 lines. Well, 1,300 plus 200 is 1,500. So that means that the books of Judith and Malachi together, that corpus, is about the same size as Esdras. Now that size, those sizes are relative within the same manuscript. Okay, so it excludes the possibility of there being inaccuracies due to different manuscript traditions or different standards or different page sizes, things like that. This is within the same stichometry in the same list. It's telling us that Esdras is about the same size as Judith and Malachi. So we can convert these books lines into word counts. We know how many words are in Judith and we know how many words are in Malachi. This is provided by the Center for Computer Analysis of Texts at the University of Pennsylvania. Okay, and it provides the Septuagintal Judith as having 9,174 words, and the Septuagintal Malachi is having 1,416 words, for a total of 10,590 words. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that the 1,500 lines of text within the Bible, which contains the Esdras of Codex Claromontanus, is about 10,590 words. Well, we can produce a similar number based on the 12 prophets. Okay, Codex Claromontanus provides that the 12 prophets contain 2,970 lines, which cut in half is 1,485 lines. It's roughly the same size as the Esdras material. So if you count all the words in the Septuagintal 12 prophets, it's 23,244 words. Cut in half is 11,622 words. So I'm throwing all these numbers at you. What does it mean? It means that those 1,500 lines in Codex Claromontanus corresponds to something between 10,590 words and 11,622 words, which averages up around 11,106 words. Okay, so it's giving us a relatively consistent figure here that this book of Esdras didn't have 200 words, but it didn't have 5,000 words, or 50,000 words or something like that. It's something between 10 and 12,000 words would have been the size of the Esdras material. Now, we can compare those now to different arrangements of the Esdras material. And what do we find? We find the exact same results, is that the Esdras size based on word count is approximately the same size or very similar to the word count of Ezra and Nehemiah, but is way different. It's much, much smaller than the total number of Esdras material in Codex Vaticanus and Alexandrinus. So what is this telling us? This is telling us that the Bible canon for the scribe who wrote the Bible list in Codex Claromontanus probably had Ezra and Nehemiah in one book. and not first Esdras, right? That's very, very interesting. Or maybe he only had first Esdras, right? Maybe it's a possibility, but I think more likely than not, it's Ezra and Nehemiah. So what's the conclusion? The 1,500 lines of Esdras in Codex Claromontanus are not large enough to have contained first Esdras, Ezra, and Nehemiah like codices B and A. Therefore, Codex Claromontanus must represent an alternative arrangement of the Esdras material. So just because a list says Esdras 2 books, it doesn't necessarily mean that those 2 books are the same 2 books as Codex Vaticanus and Codex Alexandrinus. It could have a configuration like Codex Claromontanus, which is much smaller. The size of Esdras for the scribe of Codex Claromontanus is about the same size as Ezra and Nehemiah in one book, and any variance in the size or word count we can explain with different page size, script size, local standards, something like that. But they're about the same, they're pretty close. So if the Council of Carthage and other early fathers arranged their Esdras material like Codex Claromontanus, then they were not listing first Esdras as canonical. So Codex Claromontanus offers an alternative naming convention for these books and really can offer some support, maybe not proof, but some support for sure towards that St. Jerome position, that Council of Trent position, that the 2 books of Esdras at Carthage or other lists included Ezra and Nehemiah as the 2 books of Esdras, not first Esdras, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So I think this is an interesting piece of evidence. What do you think? Do you think that this is an interesting contribution to the Esdras problem? Let me know in a comment below. But otherwise, if you haven't already, please subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.